called U.S. Senate Battlegrounds 2018. Essentially, I will be scraping this website for the states, which are the battleground states for the upcoming midterm elections in November. And then from those states, I will then be scraping the different candidates. So for example, Arizona will have these candidates, etc., etc. And the reason I chose this website or this project is because, well, originally I was going to do a movie CLI, but I realized that there are a lot of people who've already done it, and I didn't want to just be doing the same thing that everybody did. So I guess I decided to do this because, well, it's almost midterm elections, sort of. And I live in DC, and you know, current political times are very interesting, and I'm always reminded of it because of where I live. But also, additionally, I'm an immigrant, and I think the current political climate isn't very friendly to immigrants, if I dare say. And so this one hits pretty close to home. So that's why I decided to do this project. So to kind of run through my CLI, okay. All right, so the first thing you'll see is here, the scraped data. These are the 9 battleground states for the midterms. It'll say 1, Arizona, Florida, Indiana, Missouri, Montana, Nevada, North Dakota, Ohio, and West Virginia. And then from this sort of menu, you're going to choose what number corresponding to this state, or which state you want to display the candidates of. So for example, I wanted to see Arizona candidates. I would just type in 1. So there you have it. You'll have Jeff Flake as the incumbent, Democrats, the Republican candidates, the independent candidate, the Libertarian, etc. If you wanted to find out Florida candidates, you would just type 2. Same thing. It'll put out the candidates for that state. Type 3, 4, 5, 6, and finally West Virginia candidates will be these people. If you somehow accidentally typed something that is not within the range of 1 to 9, like 10, it'll just display invalid input, and it'll go back to asking you to enter the correct state number. Same thing if you type in a name instead of a number, it'll also just tell you that it's an invalid input. So simple enough. That's, oh, I don't know why it's not exiting. There we go. And then if you exit, it'll say vote wisely. So that's kind of the gist of my project. Admittedly, I already finished coding everything but before making this video, because it was kind of a very messy process, but I can still walk you through the whole thing. But just to show you the sort of finished product, so I have 3 classes. One is my CLI class, where I arranged everything. So here I have the call method, which first it'll say hello, and then it'll have you list states and then return all the scraped states from that website. And then it'll have a method, list state candidates method, where it'll return all the candidates from the different states, also scraped from the website. And then a goodbye method, which will just say vote wisely. So here it is. Individual method is basically there. It'll put out here the battleground states for midterms 2018, as you guys have seen in the CLI, and then it'll scrape these states. I will show you later what these scraper methods are, or how it's constructed. And then the list state candidates method, which will kind of follow this pattern where first you'll have a nil input, and then it's going to go into a while loop that while the input is not exit, it'll display kind of that message where, you know, you'll say if you want to find out your state's candidates, it'll please enter, you know, 1 to 9, and then it'll ask for the user's input. So then you'll have input equals get strip, and then here is kind of where the loop is built on, where if it's 1, if the input is 1, then it'll scrape the Arizona candidates. Again, I'll show you these different scrape methods in my scraper class. And if it's 2, then it'll scrape the Florida candidates. If it's 3, it'll scrape the Indiana candidates. If it's 4, scrape Missouri. 5, scrape Montana, and so on and so forth. And then if it's not a valid input, then it'll simply say invalid input. So that's kind of like the breakdown of the CLI, which again is simple enough. And then finally, my goodbye method, which just says vote wisely. So then I think I should start with a scraper method, or yeah, scraper method. So this is my scraper method. It's a huge body of code. I'm pretty sure I'll have a lot to refactor, but just to kind of go through what it does. So I have a scrape states class method. So actually all of the methods in this scraper class are all class methods. So the first thing is a scrape states method, which again will scrape the states from that website. So just to show you in binding pry that it does return the name. All right. So okay. All right. So go to terminal. Okay. Okay. So each of these will scrape the battleground state. Scraper dot scrape states. Okay. So for example, right here, this will return Arizona, etc., etc. I think it's pretty obvious what it'll return from the name. This will return Florida, and again, just to double check within the website why that works. So originally I wanted to scrape it from this table, but it was kind of tricky because it's in a table, so I scraped these labels instead. So if you inspect it, there we go, we have there span, it's a span class with an ID of Arizona. So that's how I ended up getting that's how I ended up scraping it. Same thing for Florida and all the rest of the states. Okay, so then, but if you, so for example, battleground states. So battleground states will, what basically it does is that it'll just return me the array of all the scraped states in an array version. Now I originally had this method where I would just call battleground states after I've scraped everything. But then I realized that wouldn't work in my CLI, because in my CLI I needed to have them numbered so that I could put it in a way where the user will just choose 1 if they wanted to scrape the first state candidates, 2 for the second state's candidates, etc., etc. So then I had to iterate it. And I used each with index right here, because I realized that the each underscore with index will start with like a default index of 0 or something. So I used .each with index starting with 1, and then I'll iterate that by state and index, and then I'll put out first the index, which will start with number 1, and then the name of the state. And then it'll have you create a new state object. So all of these states that will be iterated will be also new state objects, which I will show you later in the states class. So as you can see, well, actually, let me put binding.pry. Set that out. Okay, so as you can see, once you've iterated oops, hold on. And there you go. So as you can see now, it's not just returning the array of state values, it's going to iterate through the states, and then also it'll be accompanied by an index number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then here are the values of the array. And then to see state, create state. So for example, Arizona. So now, finally, I'm going to explain how I got these two methods, or why I wrote these two methods to try and simplify scraping the candidates for each state. And I will show you my GitHub to see side by side what changes I made. So initially, for each state, I had it laid out this way. Again, I set the state candidates, I set a variable of a hash with the keys of the different parties of each candidate and the pointing to values which are candidates scraped from the website. Now, and then after that, originally I would just return the hash, but because I wanted it to be in a list format, so that when I called it in my CLI, it would give me a list of all the candidates. I iterated it using each do, and I started researching how to iteate the key if the value is an array. So it basically just showed me that I would have to do the iteration twice. So one for the key in the array, and then the other one is to iterate the array so that it'll then puts out each candidate. So I ended up with this big chunk of code for each state. One for Arizona, Florida, and for all my states. And there are 9 states, so you can imagine it was a pretty big body of code. So when I was working on, I forgot what I was working on, but I was working on something with a project coach. He pointed out to me that this might be something I want to look into, that if I wanted, like, this might be something I should refactor, or is like an area for improvement in terms of refactoring, because there's a lot of repeated code, and usually he says that when you run something and there's a lot of repeated code like this, you know, there's a possibility of breaking. So then I began to kind of stub out how I can more efficiently compress this big body of code. And then I realized I started with what repeated. So first, this part pretty much repeats for every state. the double iteration. So I decided to make a new method for that, which is my enumerate method. And the enumerate method will take in an argument of the state candidates. So ideally that would be the array of candidates that I would have scraped from each state. And then it will do the same thing that I do here, which is that first it'll iterate the key and then the array for each of that hash, and then it will put out the key, and then for each array I will then iterate each candidate from that array. So now now that I have this method, I then deleted all of these from each of my state methods. So instead of writing all that body of code, I can just write scraper.enumerate and pass in the argument of the state candidates. And that immediately I thought looked way better. So my next step was to try and simplify this. And again, the same thing, I noticed that these lines of code pretty much has the same template. So I made a new method copying this template, and then the only thing that was different is the index. So I made that method to accept an argument of the index, which would then be like whatever the index is for this scraped code, that would then return the particular candidates that I'm looking for. So the new method is the scrape candidates method accepting an argument of an index. I'll have here the doc, no kogiri, and then I would set an array equal to this, again, this template of code, accepting that index. So whatever index I would pass in the method, that will then call Nokogiri to scrape this data from the website, and then I will call that array. So now that I have this method, instead of writing this whole line of code, I can just call scraper.scrape_candidates with the index number. So as you can see, it's the same thing essentially, but now it's not this whole mess of Arizona.css, parentheses, hash, MW content text. I think it's just way easier to read this way, that you have a hash, their key of different parties pointing to values of then scraped candidates. So then I guess looking at this, it makes more sense. But now the challenge is I wanted to compress this to even simpler lines of code, and that's kind of where I've been stuck, but I will just show you the possible. Oh, and just to show you that it works, okay, so for example, I'll have scraper.scrape Arizona. Okay. Here we go. It went to the wrong thing. Alright, so let's do that again. Ruby live scraper RB. Okay, scraper.scrape Arizona. So as you can see, it works. It'll return an iterated list of the candidates from the hash, and this is what my hash looks like. So incumbent, and then the incumbent candidate, which I scraped from the website, that would correspond to this line of code. And then we also have here the Democrats key that would corresponds to the array of Democrat candidates that corresponds to this line of code, and then the Republicans, the Independent, and then after all of these, I call on the enumerate method, which will enumerate this whole hash into this more readable format. So now my challenge is how to compress these 4 lines of code even more into a simpler line of code. And so far I've been exploring how to compress hashes, and I found one way is to make 2 different arrays, one for the key, one for the values. But I found that it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And if I do it this way, where I have an array for my parties and an array for my candidates, it would still give me pretty much, I don't know, the same line of code, the same amount of lines of code. So I'm tabling that for now, but so far my scraper methods work, and I'm able to call them in the CLI pretty successfully. So after I've scraped the states in this method, the next step would be, or the next step that I did was to scrape the candidates of each of those states. So that would be the level 2 scraping for this project. And as you can see here, I've separated the scraping of the candidates for each state. Initially, when I started this project, I thought of maybe doing just one method to scrape all the candidates, but I changed it because I realized when I was trying to just stub out the interface for my CLI, it would be easier if I group them per state. That way I can just call it this way. And so I decided to separate it by state. As you can kind of see here, I have an Indiana, scraping Missouri, scraping Montana, Nevada, etc. And then we'll see how that works later. But before that, I'd just like to try and explain how I got here, and I apologize that I wasn't able to record it live while I was coding it. It was a pretty long and messy process that I slipped my mind to record because I was so caught up in just trying to do it and make it work that, yeah, but I do have my GitHub, so we'll take a bit of a trip down my GitHub memory lane and see what the process was like. So 10 days ago, yes, it's been a brutal 10 days for this project. Okay, so anyway, so I started, like I said, I started drafting the CLI first. I pretty much followed the process that Avi laid out in his video, which was really, really helpful because when I first started out this project, I had no idea where to start. It seemed to be overwhelming. You have scraping, and then you have objects that you need to make them collaborate, etc. So I didn't know, and I had trouble making binding.pry work. So actually this is when I decided to shift to Atom and make a local environment on my computer, and that took 3 or 4 days. So it's a long time that I've done this project, but it's all come together, and that's cool. That's really great. So here is where I started. So I kind of stubbed out the interface, and it's pretty much what it looks kind of similar to how my CLI looks like now. I wanted, pretty like there's a call method where I would just first list the states, and then here I just put goodbye. So I was just kind of drafting, and then I wanted something to look like this, where here are the Battleground states. So the first step is I was hard coding everything, just like in Avi's video, right? And I'm glad I was able to make it work. So this is the hard-coded version of my current CLI, and then so originally I had like a list candidates, pretty simple, where I would say please enter the state and then goodbye method, vote wisely. And I've also started to require the different environments. And then, let's see. Okay, so after drafting my CLI, then I started hard coding the candidates for each state. So starting with Arizona, so pretty much like what Avi said, just drafting out how I want, each method to look like, what I want the output to look like. So I first started listing down each candidate for the state. So for example, here are the Arizona candidates, and I took that from this. Initially, I started with whatever party has the incumbent. That's what I started with, but I found that to be kind of messy when I was scraping, so now it's pretty consistent that with every state I would start with the Democrats and then the Republicans and then the Libertarians. But here it is. So that's for the list state candidates. If the input is Arizona, as you can see, it's still a pretty rough draft, and I don't think I got this working. Arizona.css, MW content text, .css, etc. This returns this whole block, which is this whole block right here. Deidre Abood, Bob Bishop. And I initially wanted to scrape individually, but that also kind of proved to be a little bit difficult, or actually a lot difficult. So instead I scraped the whole body, which successfully it gave me the whole body. Where's the, nope, not that. Where's the UL? See, it's kind of weird. Okay, so this one. MW content text. Here. There we go. And it's the 5th array of the whole thing. So I guess, so just to show you what the Nokogiri scrape thing will return without the text, it'll return these. And then if I wanted to select just the candidates, so then I added text. There. So that was kind of how I started, and then from there it was easy to scrape all the others because I just had to follow the index number. So say if I wanted to scrape, well, I didn't include the candidates who withdrew. If I wanted to scrape the Republicans, then I would just, let's say, so that would be 6, this would be 7. And there you go. It returns Joe Arpaio, Craig Britton, I don't know these people, Christian Deagle, Michael Griffin, Michelle Griffin, etc., etc. So now, then that was my pattern for scraping the candidates, which then led me to this. I want to show again, like I realized it didn't make sense to have like a candidate class because I was what I was doing was giving out the candidates for each state. So it made sense to have a state class. But then when I was working on it with my project coach, I realized that it made more sense to have a scraper class. So then, and then I edited CLI methods. Why did I edit CLI methods? Oh, and then I went back and forth. I guess this is where I realized that the candidate class didn't work because I went back and forth with putting these scrape candidates in the CLI, and then I realized that looked kind of messy. Oh, wait, no, I didn't. Oh, yeah, I just put like candidate.scrape Arizona, candidate.scrape Florida, etc., etc. Right here. Now, after I've scraped all the candidates for each state, then I edited my CLI to call that method, which is pretty much the same from how I have it set up now with my CLI, but this was like the initial phase of it where I still had a candidate class instead of a scraper class, disorganized. Okay, so my state class. So my state class will have an attribute of a name and candidates. And the name would just be the name of one of the battleground states. So when you first create a state, you would initialize it with a name, and then it would have like an empty array of candidates. And then when you call Battleground, it will display all the Battleground states. When you call, actually, let me just run everything. So that. Okay. Here is now my state class. Okay. Let me put this here. Hope I don't have a pry anywhere. Okay. So again, my state class will initialize with a name and an empty array of candidates. So for example, I'll make a new state called Arizona. Oh, sorry. Duh. To run that. Okay. So I will run Arizona. I will make a new state object, which is Arizona.